This question comes up over and over and over again. Which Bible should I read? And I wish people still ask that question on a weekly basis because only 4% of the general church membership are reading the biblical text on a daily basis. But when it does come up, you do hear that question. Well, let's go back and lay down some basic data about what is a version, what is a translation, and what is a transliteration, and see if we can bring some clarity to some of these most basic elementary points of understanding. Number one, the Bible is a collection of books that span over 1,500 years in 3 continents, if we want to be that specific. Clear from Asia Minor, clear to North Africa, clear to Europe and Israel and Judah and their captivities. So therefore, you have a very broad range of genres in the biblical text that range from prophecy to poetry, to prose, to Hebrew parallelisms, that's poetry, in a specific structure, chiastic structures. You have basically 2 languages, Greek and Hebrew for the Old Testament with little parts of Daniel in Aramaic, and even with some Babylonian loanwords with the, visions within a vision and so forth. But nevertheless, there are outside cultural influences, even from the Canaanite religion, upon the Bible, especially when you read the book of Psalms 19 through 22, which were dedicated in the Canaanite Bible to the god of the sea, or Yam, or if you look at Yahweh for the God of the land, go to Ezra 8:24, where a purification rite was offered as they went across the water back to the land, because Israel worshipped a god of the Aretz, or land, and that's where the covenant and the agricultural blessings were indeed based. Now, it is interesting that the Bible also has a Greek Old Testament. That was called the Septuagint, made by 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. This Hagiographios, sometimes called the Hagiographiton, was indeed we get the word graphe, which comes from our word graphics, in modern times, if we work modern and go backwards, to the root of these particular ideas. That the term also, hagio, would donate that it was for holy use in the temple. Somehow we've got into the idea that the Bible itself is holy, like the printing is holy. It says Holy Bible on the front. Well, it means it's for holy use in the church, that it is indeed the church's book, writes Brevard S. Childs and James Sanders. Now, because it is the church's book and reveals holy things, it is important for us to know that we have no original autographed manuscripts, and an autograph is, of course, one that is signed by the original author. All we have are text and versions that came out as, of course, the textual traditions of Israel and Judah and the New Testament church. And of course, we can talk about the Velium and how the New Testament Greek text, was from the ancient manuscripts, which we have of the New Testament, over 5,749 manuscripts. The Muratorian fragment that obviously gives us the New Testament list of books which were canonized by the Western Church and the books that they ultimately settled on. It was a little different with some of the other canonical lists, but nevertheless, it's the one the Western Church decided upon. Now, as the Bible began to be translated in translational centers of Europe and, of course, Asia Minor, throughout the Roman Empire, as well as in Byzantium, translational centers which gave way to textual traditions arose. And so, by the time of the Council of Nicaea, 50 of the translational centers were garnered to try to come up with a New Testament textual translation. And so this is where you get Vaticanus, Vatican 1209, the Ephraemi. It's, where you get the documents that were found in St. Catherine's Monastery so many years ago with Tinchendorf. And, of course, later on with these particular texts, which 4 of them survive in minor fragments, you also have receiver languages, which would be Syriac, which is a Syriac form of Hebrew. And there's a Syriac New Testament called the Peshitta out of a Greek original. And so there was a lot of moving around, from one language to another, depending on who the intended audience was. Okay, so that pretty well takes care of text and versions. Now, what about transliteration? Well, transliteration is when you use a tau for a T or an aleph for an alpha or an A. That's where you have a direct correspondence. Or bait is B. Or, H is het. Or T is tet. Or tav. What it means is that it's letter for letter. Now, you can't always do this because there are different alphabets with different sounds and different letters. Not all letters, add up to 22 letters to form an alphabet. So therefore, there are words that cannot be transliterated. Some of them can be with amazing accuracy. One of them is hallelujah. Is very close in many languages. Some of the names of God work well when you move them from Hebrew to English, some do not. One of the verses that do not work in many translations is when we say He is risen from the dead and He is Lord. It's terrible English. It forces the translators to do this because it's a past result of His resurrection, and the inward reality in the present is why we move out in the power of the resurrection. So there are certain tenses that are very hard to translate. A passive middle, an aorist infinitive, and many other tenses are really awkward, and sometimes you have to just give it your best guess. Now, what is a translation? Well, it's from a sender language to a receiver language. What is a version? A version is within the same language. You can refer to earlier texts like the King James and the Douay French version did in Latin in Douay, France in 1509. But the reason the KJV is called a version because it relies on Coverdale and the Great Bible and the Bishop's Bible in English that preceded it. Now, popular opinion says there is a Protestant canon and there is a Catholic canon. Bull honky. Did you know that the King James still has in Britain to this day the apocryphal books listed within it, including books like Judith and Tobit and 1st and 2nd Maccabees? Oh, I know what you're thinking. How can that be true? That sounds sacrilegious. I looked in my Bible and in the King James. The Apocrypha isn't there, Dr. Roberts. Why are you trying to pull one on me? Because in 1829, the American Bible Society took out the apocryphal books only to save on their printing cost. Did you hear it? Only for the cost of printing. Well, we live in today's salvational supermarket where many translations, so-called, are out there. Some of them good, like the New American Bible, and some of them, like the New Jerusalem translation, are made for poetic use in liturgical worship that come from a French original like the New English Bible does. And those translations are very good and very reliable. Most academics prefer the Revised Standard Tradition, even if you use the NARSV, because of the academic notes provided and because they agree with the textual text that was used. Recently, I had the joy of my academic life as far as translational work is concerned to take part in the military chaplain's Bible. And we were able to take the USB 4 and go through the New Testament, and my translation was 2 Thessalonians. And let me tell you, fellow saints of God and listeners, there are times when you cannot move it from one language and translate it with absolute certainty to a modern vernacular, which we were attempting to do through British English. And boy, the original Greek just will not translate that way without some paraphrasing being done. Many people feel that paraphrases work for Bible studies. And good news for modern man, J.B. Phillips, and some of the modern English Bibles that are out there today. Most scholars do not prefer them. We recommend that they might be good for reading Paul's pastoral letters to make it sound like it's written to you, like the Clear Word Bible is in our day and age. But they're really not trustworthy, because without some knowledge of what is a version, a translation, or a textual interpolation that has been read back into the text, or a textual variant where you have different manuscripts saying different things, then, of course, you have no way of knowing why the so-called translator or paraphraser has chosen the renderings that they use in their modern paraphrases. And some of them are very atrocious. So please stay with solid translations like the NRSV or the New King James or especially for liturgical worship, the New English Bible and especially the New Jerusalem would be your best choice. This is Father Tom Roberts saying thanks for listening and enjoy reading the biblical text.